Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akkad and Koka Report. I'm Michel Akkad in San Francisco, and my co-host Anish Koka is with us in Philadelphia. Now the question is, should doctors have something to say about guns? And if so, what should they say? Our guest today is Pradheep Shanker, a radiologist based in Ohio, and a prolific writer and conservative commentator who contributes regularly to a number of major national media outlets, including National Review, The American Spectator, Detroit News, and others. He just published a piece entitled Guns, Doctors, and Staying in Your Lane in Ricochet Online, which will be the topic of this episode. Pradheep, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, give us a little background about this piece. Most doctors and many people have heard about it through the media, but just, a 2-minute synopsis or even less.
Okay. Well, this all began with initially a journal article by the American College of Physicians in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And it's not uncommon for them to write such position pieces, but basically what they did was they wrote a piece where they made numerous recommendations on how the country can confront the gun violence epidemic. They've made these recommendations before, and they're kind of the standard things that we've heard about over the years, various degrees of gun regulation, especially on assault weapons, restrictions on certain criminals having guns, universal background checks. So they went through their full list. It's a relatively, if you're going to put it in a partisan light, relatively liberal kind of standard Democrat Party recommendations, which isn't unusual for ACP and other physician groups. The National Rifle Association, in their usual manner, was not so happy about this, and they wrote a blog post in response, basically telling the physicians that they didn't really understand the different facets of the gun violence problem. And of course, the now catchphrase was, between the blog piece and then what NRA tweeted out on Twitter, was physicians should, quote unquote, stay in their lane. Physicians obviously were not very receptive to this message that they should, be quiet about an issue that they obviously care about. And on Twitter, especially, social media responded very angrily. Physicians all over the country, especially trauma surgeons and others, posted things about, this is our lane, trying to adopt the whole issue to them. And they've been very effective at, mobilizing physicians. Tens of thousands of physicians have signed on to various, websites and stuff, supporting the response to the NRA. I was asked by several people to write about this. And actually, to be honest, I was kind of reluctant about it, because if you read my piece in Ricochet, I kind of took both sides of it. I as a physician myself, I feel like, we should be able to voice, our opinions about all kinds of things. With public health, so many different facets of life affect public health. I mean, no matter if you're talking about environmental policy, gun policy, economic policy, these all, in different ways affect, how, we see patients and how our patients are affected by how we can treat them and all these different things. On the other hand, I also understand the NRA's position, which is, some of the recommendations in the ACP position paper either were kind of naive or some were even downright ignorant. That doesn't mean that they were necessarily wrong. I don't want to say that, but physicians aren't exactly experts at either guns or gun law or constitutional law. So I was asked by a bunch of people, well, what was your take? And so finally, after a few days of this kind of, a boiling, on Twitter, I kind of felt like I needed to voice my kind of middle ground position. At least I think it's a middle ground position.
Okay. And are there any particular points in the ACP list of recommendations that you think were particularly off or?
Well, I'm not sure if off is the right word, but I'll give a couple of examples that I did mention in my piece. One was they made various degrees of recommendations about banning guns for people that have committed violent crimes or have had court orders, restricting them from, interacting with their spouses or girlfriends, because, obvious history of violent, acts which the courts have reacted to. That actually is already the law in most states around the country. That has been the law. Like, for example, one of the physicians that was very vocal about this, it was from California. That is the law of California now. So there's not much action to be taken on some of these issues. One of the others was they want a universal ban on semi-automatic weapons, which sounds great until you realize that most handguns, which is the most commonly purchased guns category of guns in America, and the one that people use for self-defense the most commonly, are all semi-automatic. I mean, basically, if you eliminate semi-automatic weapons, you are basically eliminating the vast majority of guns, in America. I'm not sure if this group understood what they were really recommending. Did they really want to recommend banning 90% of gun sales in this country? So I think some of these things, some comes from a little bit of ignorance, and some comes from, that this was kind of a standard boilerplate kind of Democratic Party kind of recommendations on gun control. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't speak out. I just think that we each have our bailiwick where we have our expertise, and in their position piece, some of their recommendations shows that guns specifically is not necessarily their expertise.
So I guess the one of the questions relates to staying in your lane, and I think you kind of had a nice view of it as you touched on, saying that yes, it's the yes, physicians should have an opinion. I mean, they're citizens. I mean, any citizen in the United States can have an opinion. I guess the question, what I take from a lot of the physicians that are on Twitter advocating for this and trying to say, this is our lane, does it seem to you that it's not just that, hey, I'm a citizen, I have an opinion, but hey, look, I'm a physician who, takes out bullets from spines and have to tell, moms that, their children are no longer here. It seems like they're saying that physicians should have greater weight in terms of deciding what to do with gun policy. Physicians have taken other public health stances and have been successful, say, for tobacco and smoking cessation. So I guess, what do you think about that, Pradheep? Do you think that physicians have a particularly great weight because we do take bullets out of, bodies?
I mean, this is how I view it. I think the physicians, some of them were very angry about this because they felt that they were being censored. And I am very much against censorship at all levels. Yeah. And and so in that respect, I mean, I actually, when this whole thing started, my first tweets about it, if you go back and look, were very critical of the NRA. Yeah. Because I said, I think that, each of us have come to this discussion with a lot of different viewpoints, and we have our own life stories, and physicians definitely have unique life stories because we've seen the repercussions of a lot of these patients, and in ways that other average Americans have not. So I think physicians do have a unique viewpoint that is worthy of having within the public debate. Where I think physicians have to be very careful, and I think this is even broader than this discussion is, some of us are arrogant. I'm arrogant sometimes. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you'll see me being arrogant sometimes. And I think it's kind of one of those natural things that physicians are kind of susceptible to. And one of the things in this debate, I think, is there's a lot of people that are really experts on guns, and they've been, studying them. And there's a lot of serious people on, not just the left, but on the right that have looked at, these issues for years and years and years. And they don't feel like that they should be, ignored for their expertise either, because this is there's a lot of data on this, there's a lot of evidence on this, and physicians aren't uniquely qualified to handle those kind of criminal statistics, gun statistics, or constitutional issues. So I think there is a balance. I think physicians do in many ways have a unique viewpoint when it comes to this, and I think they should be able to voice their opinions, but I'm not sure necessarily that their voices necessarily have to be weighted over other experts in other aspects of this issue.
So
you're saying,
all right, go ahead, Anish.
So you're saying we shouldn't have a God complex when it comes to.
Yeah, I mean, and we're physicians. We know sometimes we kind of get. I mean, and but I mean, I think we're not experts at everything. I mean, I talk about constitutional law on Twitter.
Yeah.
But I'm no constitutional law expert.
So
And and so I mean, these things, we are educated and we're well read, and we should have our opinions, but that doesn't mean we're necessarily experts on each facet of it.
Yeah, Michelle, do I mean, how do you differentiate?
Yeah, no, so I'm gonna be again the radical one in the room here.
Yeah.
All right.
Tell me how.
I
really
really
have a
think,
comment on smoking.
So of course, individual physicians should be free to speak out whichever way they want. I have no problem with that, but there's absolutely no reason for physician as a community of physicians to speak out on what is clearly a political issue. Gun control, gun regulation is a political issue. And there's nothing about being a doctor that gives you any special insight about the wisdom of gun control or, more gun control, less, or these regulations. As an individual, you can be, you can have your voice, and you voice it through the political process. But the problem is that we've been used for many decades, not just on guns, but just on about everything. As you said, Pradeep, at the beginning, we voice our opinion about public health issues. And actually, I'm against that. I think doctors should have nothing to say about public health issues. You should leave that to the political process. Public health issues are political. It's a political activity. It's about how you're going to, organize resources to address certain community problems. And you do this through the political process. It bothers me here that a society of internists, the ACP, speaks in the name of all internists, or of all, maybe even more, of all physicians, on this issue, and I don't care whether they're right or wrong. I think they should have nothing to do with it. There's no special expertise. Now, clearly, a lot of doctors see the sequelae of violence, in which guns are a part of, okay, and so they see bullets and whatnot. But that doesn't really give you any special insight about what to do with gun regulation.
So we are supposed to. We're supposed to care about the health of our communities. I mean, if we do what you say, then people will be driving.
What's our track record? Anish?
They'll be driving
the opioid crisis. That's our track record of getting involved with public health. Dietary recommendations, the diet wars, right? So each time we speak out, as a collectively, right? If there's this collectivist stance about what the diet of the Americans should be like, what we should do about pain, what we should do about guns.
You're cherry picking. You're cherry picking. What about the collectivist? What about the collectivist stances we've taken on seatbelts and smoking and putting statins in water?
Well, and plus, what have doctors done about seatbelts? And they haven't. It's not.
Well, let me play the hedging person, as I like to hedge all the time. I mean, I think Michelle has a good point. I think I'm very wary of medical groups taking stands like this that are clearly partisan. This ACP piece could have easily been written in the office of Nancy Pelosi. I mean, and that's nothing against Nancy Pelosi. She has an opinion too. But I think. Listen, about 15 years ago, I left the American Medical Association because I thought they were too partisan and political. And I've never joined before. And that's why the American Medical Association continues to be a more marginal group year after year. I think they're down to about 30% of all physicians. And each of these medical groups, I think, does themselves a little bit of a disservice when they do take heavily partisan positions, because we know that a lot of their members don't agree. I mean, we know this for a fact. If all of us have physician friends that, they just sit there and shake their heads and say, well, that's just how the, ACP or AMA is. Yeah, go ahead.
So the pushback, of course, is to say that, okay, let's make this apolitical. Let's make this about science.
Yeah, and you can't do that. You can't do that too either. The second part of that was, I'm a little bit wary of these groups taking partisan positions, because I think it goes away from their, kind of where doctors are supposed to be objectively scientific as much as possible, but at the same time, these are emotional issues, and human beings, you're humans just like everybody else, and for physicians to organize in such ways to mobilize for the issues that they really care about is just kind of a natural thing. So I think I'm not against the physicians taking these positions, but I do think they need to understand the other side of the coin, which later on it may devalue their voice, because some will be just like, well, you're just taking another partisan position.
So they'll point to the fact that the Dickey Amendment in 1996, correct, specifically was an act that essentially, paraphrasing, essentially said that federal dollars that goes towards harm prevention and research cannot be used and should not be used to promulgate, gun control type stuff. And they'll say that. So the effort here is to say, look, let's make this apolitical. And this is a number of our illustrious colleagues, Esther Chu wrote in an NBC article, and actually you as well in your article suggest that we should take evidence-based approaches to this, which necessarily aren't particularly partisan. Mm-hmm. And of course they'll say that, look, the NRA supports the fact that we don't want any more gun control research, and so the pushback is that this is being forced to be partisan. And people are being kept in the dark about what the real data is on guns. And if the actual data was allowed to be generated on guns, and I'd love to talk about some of the actual data and see what you guys think about that. If the actual data was allowed to come out, if we were able to show light on this, this would be nonpartisan, and we could come up with ideas that were.
Well, I fully support. I think that I'm not sure the CDC. There's a lot of arguments about which group, which organization, the government should be studying this on public health. And I mean, there's some conservatives that don't think we should be studying anything on public health. But I mean, to me, I think we should be studying it to some extent. I'm not sure CDC is the right organization, but we can have that discussion. I think more data is always a good thing. As a scientist, at heart, I think the more data we get, the more likely we are to find solutions. That said, we're not short of data on guns. I mean, that in itself is kind of right. There's tons of data on
correct, and I don't know that more data is going to help for every argument. You can find data to support the opposite arguments. I mean, on all these issues,
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't think, I know this is a common thing I hear all the time, but I don't think our reluctance to go forward on gun control is because, I just need one more study. I mean, it's a much more political discussion about what we're going to do than any date that, now I'd like more data, but I don't think that's going to dramatically change the debate.
Right, and this is where I'll take off my questioning hat and opine for 2 seconds and say that, and where I disagreed with, where I think your stance on it is this idea that, and again, that wasn't the major point of your piece. Very nice piece. I tweeted out, but one of the points was that the EBM will somehow cleanse us and give us this thing, and not to take an anti-EBM screen. But the point is that, here you have the folks that are doing the research are so ideologically cut from the same cloth that there's absolutely no way that anyone is going to trust what's coming out, what research is being generated. I mean, so that's, I think, one of the major problems in terms of the stance that a lot of folks on the left say, in terms of saying, hey, look, if we just generate more evidence, we'll be able to make this nonpartisan. And it's impossible because of, the biases of many that are doing some of this work, I think.
A huge problem that I have is what the statement that the ACP has issued, what it does to patients in general. I mean, this is an issue that clearly the ACP knows that half of the U.S. population disagrees with, right? Or more. I mean, I don't know what the stats are. I don't care about guns whatsoever. but I mean, a huge portion of patients feel very strongly about it, right? And now, if they're going to come and then, and we've had all these measures, sort of nudging or forcing doctors to ask patients about gun safety, or do you have a gun in your house, and all that stuff, right? So the more we as a collectively, I say we, but the ACP and the leaders, the organized medicine, the more they take on these overtly political positions, the more they erode the more they hamper the ability of individual doctors, to gain the trust of patients. Because now patients are going to say, well, I don't want to broach that topic at all. If he brings it up, I want to, stay away from him, or that sort of thing. So I think it's very poison. It poisons the atmosphere. It poisons medicine, and we should really completely stay away. We should stay in our lane.
Stay in our lane, yes.
But no. Michelle, people will say that, and Pradeep too. They'll say that. Well, I mean, people have loved Big Macs from the beginning of time, and should we? I mean, because it's unpopular, should we not take a position that suggests that eating 5 Big Macs a day is probably not a good thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's on a biological.
Should the ACP not take some type of a position stand and say that obesity?
No, that's reasonable. You can make an argument on a biological basis that eating 5 Big Macs is not good, right? On gun control, it's much more difficult. On gun control, it's overtly a political thing. Now, of course, it affects health, but everything affects health, as you said.
Well, let me raise this. I mean, several years ago, the Republican-led Florida legislature wanted to limit what physicians could speak to on their patients. They said they did not want physicians to have in-depth, discussions with their patients on, well, what kind of guns to use, and I was against that because of free speech things, because I think doctors have free speech just like anybody else, and government restricting them is just kind of silly. Okay, but I think that the subtle argument Michelle is making here is, should these organizations make dictates that all physicians should be talking about these guns with these patients, versus having individual physicians deciding in their offices, well, you know what, this is a discussion I think is fit for my patients. I'm willing to have this discussion. Like, I would hate to tell physicians or pediatricians, for example, you should never have this discussion about gun safety and how your gun should be stored safely so your children are safe. Now, some physicians may feel this is very important to their practices, and others may not. And so I'm willing to let individual physicians do that. And then I'm willing for patients to be smart enough to say, this is a doctor that I like because he's asking about guns. Or, this is a guy that's invading my privacy. I don't want to see this physician anymore. And I think, again, what Michelle's saying is exactly right, which is having the big ACP or AMA telling physicians, this is a good idea to go, ask these questions. I think that is troublesome. And I'm not sure it's really that effective in, solving any part of this problem.
Right. And especially with the electronic health records that are, shared widely and everything. Right. So people are going to say, well, they want to know if I have guns in.
Yeah, it's a legal document.
Right. It's a legal document, and it can be potentially, I don't think people are, people, you may think that they're paranoid if they think that it could be used against them, but you never know. It's certainly conceivable.
The reason we have HIPAA, right?
Correct. Right. Exactly. HIPAA that protects privacy so well.
Right.
So go ahead, Anish. Yeah.
So just getting to some, Pradeep, you've read a lot of, you've read a lot about this, and I can tell, and you're pretty knowledgeable about it. But some of the statistics in terms of guns, which for some makes this biological and makes this, like the eating 5 Big Macs is bad. This idea that if you have a gun in the house, you're much more likely to suffer some type of injury related to guns, or the death rate for folks is much higher. In states that have much higher rates of gun ownership, suicide rates are much higher. So over and over again, you have a bunch of data that's sitting out there that has led to more than one NEJM editorial over the years that suggests that gun ownership is is a risk factor, and that if you have a gun in the house, even though you may think that you're protecting, you feel safe and you're protected, statistically speaking, having a gun in the house makes you more dangerous than not having a gun in the house. So is for both of you, is that strong enough to give you some type of basis to say that, hey, this isn't really partisan, but we need to try to limit guns and tell people that having guns in the house is bad?
I'll tell you why it's partisan, because there's plenty of data that shows that, and it's really statistically significant, that if you're religious and if you practice your religion, your health outcomes are much better, right?
Yeah.
I don't see the ACP going around saying, people should go back to church and go and practice their religion, right? Have you seen any editorial in the NEJM about promoting religiosity in people? And if they did, I would be horrified, frankly. I would be horrified. So they should really stay out of these obviously political issues that are only remote. They're only associated. They're connected to health because, in a way, everything else is. But we have to draw the line. Are they connected to the health of the individual patient we're dealing with? And that's when you clearly see that it's much more complicated. So if you have Joe in your exam room and he tells you that he's eating 5 Big Macs a day, okay, it makes sense. I mean, there's a direct connection between this and his obesity and his health and whatnot. But the fact that he has a gun in his house and what you're going to tell him to do about it and whatnot, that's, I think, very remote. And it's only an issue if you think of it on a public health basis.
Well, I think it's kind of like the, when I was growing up, doctors thought, oh, we should ask every pediatrician should ask if their kids have seatbelts. It's kind of a similar kind of thing in a way, And the problem with the data is it's so complicated. I mean, we have something like 350, 400 million guns in this country. It's been booming, especially since about 1990. I think we've almost doubled. I'd have to look at the exact number, but the number of guns has been increased by at least 100 million over the last 15, 20 years. During that same period of time, homicide rates are plummeted. I mean, and so we have a ton more guns, but we're actually much, much safer today than we were in the 1970s and early 1980s. So we have these kind of mixed signals, and I think, yes, we have more guns than anybody else in the world, and that leads us to unique problems. But those unique problems aren't easily solved by any of the recommendations being made today. I mean, people talk about assault weapons ban, which is all fine and dandy. First of all, you're not going to go and take the 100 million or 75 million or whatever is assault weapons that people are already holding. So there's more assault weapons than we ever know what to do with for the next century. Banning new sales isn't going to change much. Then, and then you look at the recent, California shooting. I mean, this, probably mentally ill veteran who was seen several times by police. They could have intervened. They did not. He was supposedly a nice guy. When you talk to his friends, I mean, they are all shocked. This guy goes into a bar and starts shooting with, throws gas bombs and, and what did he shoot with? He shot with one handgun, legally purchased. I mean, now almost none of the solutions that anybody is talking about would have stopped this guy. And this is where I'm so, and so this is such a complicated problem. It's such an emotional problem. It's a huge tragedy that happened in California. But we walk around the solution because nobody wants to really want to delve into, oh my God, maybe we can't stop this guy from getting a handgun. And, so what that goes back to with physicians is we're supposed to be evidence-based. What is the evidence that any of the solutions we are proposing right now would have stopped that shooter? Until we as physicians can say absolutely, oh yeah, here's my evidence-based solution for that, I think we have to be at least humble in how we approach it, if nothing else, because it doesn't look like we have a better solution than anybody else does.
Yeah, I guess the problem with this whole evidence-based solution is that then, there's also no evidence that, guarding synagogues is going to protect synagogues.
Yeah, sometimes we can do practical. Sometimes we can do practical things even without evidence. But when
Yeah.
you're talking about constitutional rights, now you have to be very careful about what steps are we going to take without evidence. We can't just, some of these things are common sense things. I understand that, like, for example, having background checks makes sense, and, for the most part, even the NRA and others agree with that. There's things that we can actually agree on. I just think physicians shouldn't go too far out on that limb when there isn't a ton of evidence that says, oh, our solutions are dramatically better than what anybody else is suggesting.
Well, anything else on? Have we covered?
No, we covered a lot. But
have we gone off our lane?
Yeah, we're on all over the lanes.
Right.
The one interesting,
through the lanes. Yeah.
the interesting thing that I thought as part of the ACP guidelines was their treatment of mental health. Right, it was very interesting that they had a bunch of different things, and then actually a bunch of things, domestic violence. If you abusers of whatever, and then you mentioned the fact that in many states that it was illegal for folks who were, it was already kind of on the books, if you will. But there's this an interesting carve out for the mentally ill because they don't want to stigmatize, I guess, mental illness. Do you think, Pradeep, that in your perfect world as a conservative, what would you see? Do you see, what do you think about that carve out for the mentally ill?
Well,
and do you think a lot of the problem has to do with how not only society is dealing with the mentally ill and problems in terms of society and why this is happening, but also do we have blinders on as physicians? Is this a place that we're being partisan in terms of being too gentle and treating this with kid gloves here?
I think there's a couple issues. First of all, I think outside of gun violence, we have a mental health epidemic in this country. I mean, even if you don't want to talk about guns, we have, suicide rates are increasing. We see the drug abuse problem, like opioid problem increasing. So we have a mental health problem, even separate from the gun violence issue. That's the first thing. Now, outside of that, I personally don't know the answer, and I mean I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't treat mentally, any mental health diseases or anything like that. So I want to be a little bit, humble in myself. But I really think we have to have this debate about, have we given maybe too much freedom to persons that have mental health issues that have violent tendencies. We've seen it over and over and over again, whether it's the Virginia Tech shooting or this California shooting, or there's, you could go through every single one of these episodes. These mass shootings tend to be related to mental health things. So I think where our bias as physicians is we're worried about the individual patient, which is what our job is. I mean, that is our partisan blinder. But from a public health standpoint, if you're going to talk about gun violence, I think you have to say, well, maybe we have to look at these mental health issues and see, do we have to be more invasive to people that have, shown these violent tendencies? I tend to think the answer is yes, but of course that comes with a lot of repercussions, not just medically or ethically, but also legally and constitutionally. But I mean, right now, I just feel like nobody's having that discussion. And I really feel the ACP kind of let down the medical community and the greater community at large by not trying to have the mental health discussion. If you read their, piece, basically they say, oh yes, these people that, have committed, are violent and have committed crimes should not get guns, but we shouldn't be too harsh against the mentally ill. It's kind of like, well, okay, I understand that, but, that's not really, taking a strong position on this. It's kind of hedging their bets altogether. So I think the ACP and physicians might be able to lead on this as a group that's, very interested in protecting individuals that have mental illness, but still understanding this is a public health issue. But so far, we've failed in confronting that.
Well, Pradeep, I think you've clearly highlighted how complicated all these issues are, and they truly are complicated, and all the more reason to be humble and not
Yes.
pretend we can solve all the problems, and we don't, as physicians, we don't have a great track record, as I said before, And so on that note, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we look forward to continue to reading you more in the coming weeks and months.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Pradheep.